When you are exploring in the backcountry and you are shooting a television show at the same time, Murphy's Law always seems to kick in and no story goes as planned, right? But in life, I guess the challenges and the hurdles are what make adventures fun. And today's story is all about one of those instances. One of those trips that I thought was going to put me in my deathbed. Trust me on that. Hey there, it's Bill Sherck, the man about the woods, and welcome to the Minnesota Bound podcast, the stories behind the stories, presented by Connecticut Water Treatment Systems. My family uses Connecticut, and you should too. Also, Star Bank, the bank we use at Minnesota Bound. Can't forget our good friends at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And a big shout out to our newest partner on the Minnesota Bound podcast, the Minnesota Propane Association. Thanks for the support. It's great to have you guys on board. Okay, time for a story. A lot of the feedback I get is about the trips we take during the coldest days of winter back into the bush, off the grid in the boundary waters. And I had a dream trip all planned up. Photojournalist Aaron, the big Paul Bunyan looking guy with the beard who carries the camera around, he and I decided we were going to roam back to a boundary waters lake called Caribou. It's not terribly treacherous to get back in there. You strap on skis or snowshoes and the polk sled, the gear sled, and it's a couple miles, maybe 3-4 miles back in to get where we wanted to go. Our destination was a lake called Caribou. And the idea was we were going to get in, get our camp set up. This was right at the end of January, so temps were pretty cold at the time. And we were going to sneak in, get a nice camp set up, and then one of my outdoor mentors, a guy by the name of Dan Cook of Cook Custom Sewing fame, the guy who looks like Santa Claus with the big white beard, he's a hardcore winter trekker, and he was going to come in with a crew and meet us a day or two later. So Aaron and I had our gear packed up in the sleds, and we hit the trail. I had snowshoes on for this trip. It's funny, when you're traveling off the map, so to speak, that part of the world, far northern Minnesota, gets a lot of snow. So it's not unusual to have snow up to your waist in the woods. And the snowshoes are a huge help. They give you traction, they float on the snow. Keep in mind, we're pulling these 10-foot long gear sleds loaded down with 100, 120 pounds of gear. So the snowshoes sort of cut a path as you pull your sled. And the first part of our journey was pretty simple. There's a skiing and hiking trail off the Gunflint, and we were going to cruise that for about a quarter of a mile to get back into the portage that leads into the boundary waters. And it's funny, we were in a great mood. The weather was beautiful, like 25 degrees. The cold had not come, and calm, and the woods were just covered in a heavy white blanket of snow. Here lies the problem. As soon as Aaron and I take a left turn off the snowshoe trail and start to hit the portage back to what's called Swamp Lake, which was on our way to get to Caribou, oh gosh, we hit deep snow. And on top of that, all the trees were tipped over. We had not done a good job of planning or not paid close enough attention, but the North Shore of Minnesota had whipped up one of those Lake Superior winter storms, and they had had an ice storm a few days before we arrived. So all the trees were bogged down with ice. So you can picture tamaracks and pines and poplars all iced over and just bending right over, almost like fishing rods, which made getting down our new trail awfully tough. But hey, we're shooting a television show, right? We're trying to get back to this lake. We're trying to document the adventure. So we pushed on. We trudged on, and we made our way back towards Swamp Lake. And pretty soon, the trail became impassable. And at this point, we were several hours into the trip. We had not made great distance, but it was a little bit like we were trapped back in the woods. 10-foot long trails in the deep, or sleds in the deep woods. It's hard to turn them around, right? You don't just whip a Yui and get out of there. So I pulled out my bow saw and started to cut. You can imagine what that was like. With these pine trees bent over, I'm sawing away. Snow and ice are falling out of the trees. I talked about Murphy's Law, right? The cold tingle of snow and ice going down the back of my anorak jacket. It put me in a foul mood in a hurry. But TV camera is rolling as photographer Aaron shoots away, so you keep your chin up and you keep cutting. And we'd make 10 feet. We'd cut again. We'd make another 10 feet. We'd cut again. And this process went on probably 2 hours. I was spent. Aaron was frustrated. We were pushing our way into the woods, and we had a pretty good idea, according to our maps, that Swamp Lake was just maybe 100, 150 yards ahead of us. And that's when the saw broke. Snap. Turns out one of the bolts holding the blade to the bow saw fell out, and the saw was deemed dead. And that's just the start of the story. Trust me. Little bush fix. We had ropes, so I lashed the saw blade back on and got back to cutting, and eventually made it to Swamp Lake. Couldn't believe it. We were 4 or 5 hours into this trip already, and we had not gone a mile. Quite an adventure. And that was just the start of the trouble on our fateful Caribou Lake trip. The next chapter, it gets a little sticky. But first, let's talk a little bit about a few of our sponsors that help make the Minnesota Bound podcast happen. Up first, Connecticut. Connecticut water. Do you know Connecticut? Well, the Sherck family certainly does. We live out in the country and we've got that well water, but you know what? Connecticut solved all of our water issues. In fact, we don't just use their softening system, we've also got Connecticut's K5 drinking water system. And you know that white buildup you get on faucets and that foul egg smell to kind of that sour well water? Connecticut took care of all of it. Don't forget to call Connecticut. Do like the Shercks did and look forward to clean, safe water. Also, we'd like to welcome our newest partner, the Minnesota Propane Association.
Hey, I'm Laura Shera, and did you know, according to the Environmental Protection Agency Energy Star program, that propane is almost 3 times more efficient than grid electricity? We all care about our planet, so let's use energy efficiently to reduce our environmental footprint. You can heat your homes, your water, your cabins, your businesses with propane. The right energy right now. Propane, clean American energy. For more information, go to propane.com.
So this podcast is all about the stories behind the stories. And we're going back to a winter camping trip that photographer Aaron, our Paul Bunyan-like photojournalism leader, and I took up in the Boundary Waters. We were trying to bushwhack our way after an ice storm back to a very remote lake in the Boundary Waters called Caribou. And we were under deadline because we were supposed to meet Dan Cook back there at some point. But a trip that would normally take 5, 6, maybe 7 hours felt like it was going to take days. We first bushwhacked down the portage to a little lake called Swamp, cutting our way in after an ice storm had tipped all the trees over. Uh, so mid-afternoon, we finally hit the lake named Swamp. And if you've ever taken one of these trips, those moments as you exit the forest and you hit the wide open space of a lake is such a relief because now you can make tracks. Now you can book across the lake and make a lot of distance in a little bit of time. Or so Aaron and I thought. As soon as we got about 100 paces with snowshoes and big winter gear sleds behind us, out onto that lake, we started to sink down. Remember, we were there just days after a winter storm had pelted the North Shore of Minnesota, one of those classic Lake Superior winter gales. But something happens in the boundary water after heavy snow and ice. All that stuff sits on the lakes up there, and what do you think it does? It weighs down the ice. And as the ice gets pushed down into the lake, guess what comes up? Water. Aaron and I found ourselves trying to trudge through lake slush. It was 12 or 14 inches deep. And here's what is so important about these trips. It's the old Boy Scout motto. You always have to be prepared. Because although we were only at this point probably 1.5 miles off the road system, something like that, it's not like we could just turn around and get out of there in a matter of minutes. What happens if boots fill up with slush? Feet don't get cold, feet freeze. You try to figure it out. Pretty soon you have wet hands, wet mittens, wet gloves. So what may not seem real important can become dire in a big hurry. Now, Aaron and I were geared up with waterproof winter boots. Again, we had snowshoes. Snowshoes help keep you up on top a little bit above that slush. But as you take each step, 1 foot in front of the other, as you make slow distance, grinding away, moving forward so slowly, ice builds up on snowshoes. A few drops here freeze up. They touch the snow. The snow sticks to those drops, and you repeat that over and over and over. And pretty soon, the snowshoes are blocks of ice. That's how it happens, and that's what happened to us. On top of that, that slush sticks to the bottom of the sleds. Seasoned winter campers who pull poke sleds always have ice scrapers. You know the things you keep in your car? You always have those along to scrape the bottom of your sled in case you run into slush on lakes. And up there, it happens. We realized we had no chance of getting to Caribou Lake. No chance. The other part of the story I didn't tell you about, we knew the forecast was calling for another storm. And as we tried to push to the west, we could see gray skies turning dark. We knew weather was coming. We knew this trip was going to change. So I pulled off the snowshoes. I unhooked the sled. And I made a mad dash looking for some part of the lake on Swamp we could get to where, number one, we could avoid the slush. Because my teepee that I take on these trips, my Seek Outside teepee with the little titanium lightweight stove, because it's got such a big footprint, you can't just set it up in the woods in the Boundary Waters. We set up on the lake. And if we're setting up on a lake that's covered in slush, you get the picture. Bad scenario. So I set out to try and find a dry part of the lake where there would not be any slush. And sure enough, we got it. I made my way back to Aaron. It was probably 400 yards to the point where we would set up. We geared up. We started to get a little nervous because there was a little light snow starting to fall. While it looked pretty, we knew we were in a pinch. I strapped on my sled. I banged the ice shoes or the snowshoes until the ice came off, and we pushed forward to that point on Swamp Lake. Eventually getting there right as darkness set in. And the wind. We had wind now. Heavy, strong wind. But part of the fun of these adventures is the challenge. We were wiped out, I'm going to tell you. Aaron and I had it. We had cut through a trail full of iced over trees that were snapped off and bent over the trail. We had hiked across Swamp Lake, probably more than a mile through heavy slush. And we had found a dry, high area on the lake where there was no slush. And together in that wind, as the snow started to fall, Aaron held the teepee center pole up. I worked around the outside edge, banging stakes down into the ice. Not paying much attention to detail, but just getting it done. And we got that shelter to stand. It wasn't perfect. There were some areas that flapped a little bit, but we were able to crawl inside, get some sleeping bags out. I snapped on a headlamp and ran up to the point and snuck back into the woods. Finally, a bit of good luck. We had one nice pine tree down, tipped over, just a foot or two above the deep snow in the woods. I was able to use our rigged up saw to cut some chunks and get them back to the teepee. Aaron was ready and waiting. He had the hatchet, and he split those pine chunks, and soon enough we had a warm fire crackling in that little titanium stove. And we looked at each other and we said, this is what adventures are all about. It's funny because in the story that eventually hit the air, nobody saw the rush during that storm of us trying to get the teepee up. It was dire enough that we knew we had to stop with the television bit and work a little bit on protecting ourselves. Aaron put the camera down and we went to work and we got our camp set up. And that is the best part of those trips. The glow of the fire in the stove, the warmth inside the teepee as a fair winter storm raged on outside. Teepee flapped, making that familiar sound. If you've ever been in a tent at night in heavy wind, you know what that sounds like. There's more to the story, though, believe it or not. But first, we need to pay some bills. You're listening to the Minnesota Bound podcast, the stories behind the stories. I'm your host, Bill Sherck, the man about the woods. And the podcast is sponsored by a bunch of great partners, including our friends at Star Bank.
Hi there, Ron Shera here for Star Bank. If you're putting your money into mega banks down the street, who knows where that money's being used? Bank locally. Keep your money local with a community bank that actually cares about you, your family, your business, and your goals. Check out the bank we use at Minnesota Bound. Try Minnesota's own Star Bank. You can find them online at starbank.net. When you call Star Bank, you actually hear a real living person answering the phone. Star Bank has 10 convenient locations around Minnesota to serve you and all the mobile banking products that you need to manage your money. Check out all that Star Bank has to offer at starbank.net.
The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources also sponsors the Minnesota Bound podcast.
I just want to thank the Minnesota DNR, and as we know, Minnesota's wildlife management area are a vast array of lands across all of Minnesota, and there are approximately 1,400 wildlife management areas that are valued for wildlife in Minnesota's outdoor recreation opportunities. So speaking of recreation, to find out more about Minnesota's wildlife management areas, you can go to mndnr.gov/WMAS.
Outside, The storm raged on. Rage is a strong word, but it applies. We had wind, probably 25 to 30 miles an hour, snapping at our teepee. It wasn't perfect, but it was shelter, and we were safe. Inside, the dry pine from the woods crackled in the stove. Aaron and I tucked into sleeping bags, licked our wounds after one of the toughest single days we had had, and we giggled a little bit, because this is why we love these trips. And as the storm went on, we drifted off to sleep. If you ever winter camp, you will realize daylight hours are short. Nights are long, which means it's not unusual to sleep 9 hours, sometimes 10 hours, because it's dark at 4 in the afternoon and 7 o'clock at night feels like 1 in the morning. Aaron and I had a long night of rest, and we woke up in the morning to bright skies. We stoked the fire in the teepee, slowly woke up. You will notice every single camping tale I am a part of, you will always see a percolator. I love the sound of coffee in a percolator, and I love the taste even more. We dropped a couple of mugs of hot coffee and then decided to sneak outside. The teepee was still standing, but it had taken a beating. We guessed about 8 inches of snow overnight, but it was wind-driven snow, and we were on the downwind side of the lake. So the teepee in spots looked a little bit sad, with heavy snow drifts blown up over the sides. But it was light out. The storm had passed. So we did a little work on our home. We cleared the snow. We restaked it. We got the lines taut. Pretty soon the teepee stood tall. The tarps were tight. We were home. But I realized we were supposed to be meeting Dan Cook on an entirely different lake. A lake that we presumably couldn't get to because the portage from Swamp into Caribou was twice as long as what we had fought through to get just to Swamp. You don't have cell service. Communication is difficult in the bush, so we decided to make the best of it. And I started to fish, drilled a few holes with my hand auger, and kept my eyes out. And wouldn't you know, about 2 in the afternoon that day, I saw a dot out on the horizon. Too far to make out exactly what it was, but I knew it was something moving. Was it a moose? Was it a random deer that made its way up there? Pretty soon 1 dot became 2. And I thought, those are people. They're hiking. Certainly it wouldn't be Dan. He was supposed to take a different route into Caribou. But as the dots grew darker and grew closer and grew bigger, I realized that was Dan and the crew. They were making their way towards us. And as the camera rolls, Dan and I embraced as old friends do during reunion. We realized this was going to be one of the best television tales we had ever documented. That's the story behind the story. And that was quite a trip. Sometimes it's not about how many miles you make, but instead how rich the adventure can be. Hey, we appreciate you listening to the Minnesota Bound podcast, the stories behind the stories, presented by Connecticut Water Treatment Systems. Clean, safe, great tasting water. Also, the Minnesota Propane Association, the newest member of the Minnesota Bound podcast. And who could forget our good friends at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And of course, Star Bank, the bank we use at minnesotabound.com. Hey, take some time, get outside, push your comfort level, search for new adventures, and don't ever forget to introduce a kid to the great outdoors.